Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. What would make Vladimir Putin end the war in Ukraine is a question that echoes across capitals, battlefields, and ordinary homes far beyond Eastern Europe. It is a question diplomats whisper behind closed doors. Soldiers wonder about in frozen trenches, and civilians ask as air raid sirens interrupt their sleep. The war has reshaped global politics, shattered assumptions about European security, and dragged the world into a prolonged confrontation whose end feels distant and uncertain. To understand what could truly compel Putin to stop the war, one must move beyond slogans and propaganda and examine power, fear, survival, and history as seen from the Kremlin. For Vladimir Putin, the war in Ukraine is not just a military campaign. It is deeply personal, ideological, and existential. He has repeatedly framed Ukraine not as a sovereign nation, but as a historical mistake, an extension of Russian civilization that must not be allowed to drift permanently into the Western orbit. Ending the war without achieving what he considers core objectives would mean more than defeat on the battlefield. It would represent a collapse of the narrative he has built over decades, one that portrays Russia as a resurgent great power reclaiming its rightful place in history. One factor that could push Putin toward ending the war is a clear and undeniable military stalemate that turns into strategic failure. Not just slow advances or temporary setbacks, but a situation where Russia can no longer realistically achieve its goals, no matter how many troops, missiles, or resources it throws into the fight. Wars often end not when one side is completely defeated, but when leaders finally accept that further fighting will only worsen their position. If Ukrainian forces, backed by sustained Western military support, continue to blunt Russian offensives, retake key territories, and impose heavy costs, the Kremlin may eventually face a hard truth. Victory is unattainable. However, military pressure alone is rarely sufficient to force an authoritarian leader to stop a war. Putin has demonstrated a high tolerance for casualties and suffering, both among his soldiers and civilians. Russian history, as portrayed by the Kremlin, glorifies endurance and sacrifice. As long as the Russian state can maintain control over information and suppress dissent, battlefield losses may not translate directly into political pressure. What changes this calculation is not just losses, but the perception that the war threatens regime stability itself. Economic pressure is another crucial factor. Sanctions imposed by Western nations have already reshaped Russia's economy, cutting off access to advanced technology, freezing assets, and limiting energy revenues. Yet Russia has adapted better than many expected, finding new trade routes, relying on China, India, and other non-Western partners, and tightening state control over key sectors. For Putin to consider ending the war, economic damage would need to reach a point where it undermines the loyalty of elites, weakens the state's ability to fund the military, or sparks widespread unrest that security forces struggle to contain. This is where time becomes a double-edged sword. Prolonged war drains resources, erodes infrastructure, and accelerates demographic decline. Russia's population is aging, and the loss of tens of thousands of working-age men has long-term consequences. If the war stretches on for years with no clear end in sight, the cumulative economic and social costs may begin to outweigh the ideological benefits. At that stage, even a leader as resolute as Putin may start looking for an exit that preserves as much face as possible. Another powerful motivator could be a shift in domestic political dynamics. While open opposition in Russia is severely suppressed, discontent can still simmer beneath the surface. History shows that wars often end when elites turn against them. If influential figures within Russia's political, military, or economic establishment begin to see the war as a threat to their own survival and wealth, pressure on the Kremlin could intensify. This does not necessarily mean a coup or revolution. Even subtle resistance, foot dragging, or private negotiations can change the calculus at the top. International isolation also plays a role. Putin has long sought recognition as a global power broker, someone whose approval matters on the world stage. The war has significantly narrowed Russia's diplomatic options. Many countries that once tried to balance relations between Moscow and the West now keep their distance. If Russia becomes increasingly dependent on a small number of partners, particularly China, Putin may find that his strategic autonomy is eroding. Ending the war could be seen as a way to re-enter global diplomacy on more favorable terms, even if relations with the West remain strained. Security guarantees are another key element. From the Kremlin's perspective, one of the core reasons for the war is the fear of NATO expansion and Western influence near Russia's borders. Whether these fears are justified or exaggerated, they are central to Putin's worldview. Any realistic scenario in which he agrees to end the war would likely involve some form of assurance, formal or informal, about Ukraine's future military alignment. This does not mean Ukraine surrendering its sovereignty, but it does suggest that compromises around security arrangements could become part of negotiations. Yet the greatest obstacle to ending the war may be Putin's own belief system. He has repeatedly framed the conflict as a struggle against the West itself, portraying Russia as defending its culture, values, and independence from Western domination. When a war is cast in such civilizational terms, compromise becomes politically dangerous. Admitting failure would undermine the narrative that has justified repression at home and confrontation abroad. For Putin, ending the war requires not just changing policy, but reshaping the story he tells the Russian people. This is why the concept of an off-ramp is so often discussed by diplomats. An off-ramp is not a victory, but a way to stop fighting without total humiliation. History shows that even the most aggressive leaders often need a face, saving mechanism to end wars. This could take the form of a ceasefire framed as a pause, territorial arrangements described as temporary, or agreements presented as protecting Russian speakers or preventing further NATO expansion. The details matter less than the perception of dignity and control. The role of Western unity cannot be overstated. If Putin believes that Western support for Ukraine will weaken over time, he has little incentive to end the war. Political divisions, election cycles, economic fatigue, and competing global crises all feed into this calculation. Conversely, consistent and long-term commitment to Ukraine signals that time is not on Russia's side. Ending the war becomes more attractive when prolonging it no longer promises strategic advantage. Personal factors also matter. Putin is not immortal, and he is acutely aware of how history will judge him. Leaders who rule for decades often become obsessed with their legacy. The war in Ukraine now defines Putin's place in history more than any other event of his presidency. If he comes to believe that continuing the war will leave him remembered as the man who weakened Russia rather than restored it, that realization could influence his decisions. Legacy is an intangible force, but for leaders nearing the later stages of their rule, it can be decisive. External shocks could also accelerate an end to the war. A major military disaster, a sudden economic collapse, or a crisis elsewhere that demands Russia's full attention could change priorities overnight. Wars rarely end exactly as planned. They often conclude after unexpected events reshape the strategic landscape. Putin's decision-making, while centralized, is not immune to chaos and uncertainty. At the same time, it is important to recognize that ending the war does not necessarily mean achieving peace. A ceasefire could freeze the conflict without resolving underlying issues, creating a tense standoff similar to other post-Soviet conflicts. For Putin, such an outcome might be acceptable if it preserves Russian influence and buys time. From Ukraine's perspective, this would be deeply problematic, leaving the country vulnerable to future aggression. The difference between ending active combat and achieving a durable peace is enormous. Ultimately, what would make Putin end the war is not a single factor, but a convergence of pressures that alter his cost-benefit analysis. Military stalemate, economic strain, elite dissatisfaction, international isolation, and fears about legacy must all align in a way that makes continuing the war more dangerous than stopping it. Until that balance shifts decisively, the conflict is likely to drag on, exacting a heavy toll on Ukraine, Russia, and the world. The tragedy is that wars often end only after the conditions for peace have already been paid for in blood. Every additional month of fighting deepens wounds that will take generations to heal. For Putin to end the war, he must see not just an exit, but a future for Russia that does not depend on endless confrontation. Whether that realization comes sooner or later will shape not only Ukraine's fate, but the global order for decades to come. In the end, the question is not simply what would make Putin end the war, but when the realities of power, pressure, and consequence finally outweigh the illusion of control. History suggests that even the most determined leaders eventually face that moment. The world is waiting to see when and at what cost it arrives.